Good morning, and thank you for joining us at Starting and Growing Resilient Communities. This is our fourth session. Today we'll be talking about becoming trauma-informed. Our current panelists are going to be myself. I am the Tennessee and Midwest Community Facilitator for ACEs Connection. We're going to have Anthony Solano, PhD from NYU McSilver Institute in Brite Resources, and also Suki Steckel from the University of Tennessee College of Social Work. Again, thank you for joining us. And I also want to take this time to ask that if you are listening and you are not currently a member of ACEs Connection, to please join us at www.acesconnection.com. A few housekeeping rules. So first, no need to raise your hand. Please use the Q&A icon for any questions. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. This session is also being recorded and will be available for future viewing. And any questions or concerns that are not able to be addressed during this webinar will be answered via acesconnection.com. So first, ACEs Connection is a social network that recognizes the impact of ACEs on shaping adult behavior and health outcomes, and promotes trauma-informed and resilience-building practices and policies in all families, organizations, systems, and communities. Our social network is kind of like the Facebook for the ACEs movement. It was launched in 2012 by Jane Stevens, who is a health science and technology journalist. She realized the need to educate the public about ACEs science and create a social network for people interested in the newly emerging field. Currently, over the last 7 years, we have grown to about 30,000 members. We cover about 40 countries, and there are also 300 city, county, and regional or state ACEs initiatives on our site. We receive funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the California Endowment so that all of our tools, resources, and supports are free to members. I want to take the time to do a call to action that if you are a member, and first that you either become a member of your local initiative. This can be found under the Communities tab on the site. Or if there is not a local initiative for you, that you, feel free to join us and create an online community that's reflective of your community as well. Today, again, we're talking about becoming trauma-informed. So we'll do a series overview. We will discuss what it is to be trauma-informed. We'll discuss developing a bifocal lens, and then roadmap to resilience, which is just a strategy that is being employed in the state of Tennessee to address becoming trauma-informed. So first, a series overview. This series, Starting and Growing Resilient Communities, is really about helping individuals start an initiative and all the things that go along with that. So our last 3 sessions, we did a series overview in January. We talked about organizing your ACEs initiative in February. Last month, we discussed launching an ACEs initiative, and then this month, we're talking about becoming trauma-informed. Next month, we'll talk about how to tell your community story, and then in June, we'll discuss developing leadership. Future sessions will be announced at a later time. So first, what is trauma-informed? So in 2014, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration released a document titled Concept of Trauma and Guidelines for Trauma-Informed Approach. The purpose of this document was to develop a working concept of trauma and trauma-informed approach, and then to develop a shared understanding of these concepts that would be acceptable and appropriate across an array of service systems and stakeholder groups. These guidelines were initially meant for the behavioral health sector, but could be adopted in other sectors like child welfare, education, criminal and juvenile justice, primary health care, the military, and any setting that has the potential to either ease or exacerbate an individual's capacity to cope with traumatic experiences. And this is really any organization group, especially workplaces, even in the private sector, can adopt trauma-informed practices. SAMHSA's guidelines integrate 3 parts. So they integrate trauma-focused research. They also integrate practice-generated knowledge about trauma interventions. And then probably most important, they integrate the lessons articulated by survivors of traumatic experiences who have had involvement in multiple service sectors. That document outlined key assumptions that organizations should take into account. So first, that the program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies and procedures. And then lastly, and probably most important, seeks to resist re-traumatization. SAMHSA's key principles: first, safety, and that would encompass physical safety, but also psychological safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and then of course, cultural, historical, and gender issues. And so as organizations or groups or institutions are becoming trauma-informed, these should be the guiding principles for their practice. And then when it comes to actual implementation, the 10 implementation domains are governance and leadership, policy, the physical environment, engagement and involvement, cross-sector collaboration, screening, assessment, and treatment services, training and workforce development, progress monitoring and quality assurance, financing and evaluation. And so these domains are really talking about, once you are implementing trauma-informed practices, they need to be in each one of these domains within your workplace or practice or organization. And so in order for you to truly be trauma-informed or being involved in trauma-informed care, you have to take all of these different domains into account. And so next, we're going to hear from our first guest. I actually met this guest when I was attending NatCon 19. He is really big on resilience, and I really liked his lens when he talked about becoming trauma-informed. And so I'm going to give it over to Dr. Salerno, and he will talk about developing a bifocal lens.
Okay, thanks so much, Ingrid. Hopefully everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. So it really is a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to share with you sort of an evolution that I've gone through over the last several years. And I've been in the field for a very long time, working with adults with serious mental illness, inpatient and outpatient settings, working at statewide in New York State around promoting evidence-based practices. And now being at NYU at a Poverty Institute, as well as working for the National Council, which I started about 8 years ago with a real focus on creating learning communities around trauma-informed care. And so working with many, many organizations. And really during that time, there was a great emphasis, as really we've really had a great emphasis since the ACEs study. And people are looking very closely at understanding the degree to which adversity in a person's life is having an impact on their overall health and well-being. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to kind of feel like, wow, this seems very familiar to me, who had just done a lot of clinical work as a psychologist and working again in inpatient, outpatient settings with people with serious mental illness, that the lens was still very much focused on what was going wrong and the adversity and the consequences of that adversity, and then looking at treatment interventions to sort of address it. And I think there was a piece that was sort of like really missing, and I think it's often missed, in the field, and that's that whole area of resilience. So what I really begin to sort of think about is how do we create a bifocal lens so that we certainly can recognize and understand the degree to which life adversity has a profound effect upon a person's overall health and well-being. But there's the other side of the coin, right? Or the other part of the lens, which is all the strengths and the capacity that individuals bring, looking at environments that can strengthen and support, not just avoid re-traumatizing somebody, which of course is critically important, but that's not the same as helping people to really thrive. And how do you strengthen people's capacity to deal with not just past challenges, but current challenges and future challenges that people are likely to encounter? So that's sort of like the background of where, I've kind of come to this sort of perspective, and I really just look forward to sharing it with you. Let's see the next slide. So this is kind of like sums it up for me when I was going through some of the literature, and this says it as well as anyone that I've come across. And rather than spending so much of our time examining the negative consequences of trauma, clinicians, researchers, all of us can learn to simultaneously evaluate and teach methods to enhance resilience. And this type of approach moves the field away from purely deficit-based models of mental health toward the inclusion of strength and competency-based models that focus on prevention and building strengths in addition to addressing psychopathology. So that sort of sums it up for me in terms of what the paradigm shift is. How do we need to think of this a little differently? Next slide. So defining resilience, you'll see a lot of definitions out there. So one is a stable trajectory of healthy functioning after a highly adverse event. Many of my psychology colleagues and others, they're very interested in this area of resilience. And one of the first struggles is, well, what is it, right? Is defining it. I kind of like this other definition. And this was Dr. Yehuda from Columbia. I have to admit that the best description of resilience is one I heard on TV in connection with the Timex watch commercial. For those of you who are closer to my age, you might remember the Timex watch commercials. But the watch was described as having the ability to take a licking and keep on ticking. And the idea here is that people who've gone through adversity can really take a lot of bumps in life, right? But they kind of keep moving forward. And I think that that's sort of like an important principle, is that as the next slide will, I think, show, if we go to the next slide. That when we think about resilience, thinking of it in a much more complex way. One is something that develops through a dynamic process. So there's individual factors and there are environmental factors. I think that's a really important concept. If you go through the literature in the research, there's a big emphasis on what resides in the individual and less focus on really the context, the environment. And I think that's an important principle. Also, some of the research might suggest that it's like a trait of an individual. You either got it or you don't. And I'm going to challenge that kind of perspective. So it's also something that exists on a spectrum, right? From it isn't as if you've got it or you don't got it, but some folks in certain situations, they're having a really tough time responding in a way that's resilient, and other times being able to respond in many situations well. And people really vary on their capacity to cope effectively with challenges. It's something that can also change over time. I think that's one of the issues, right? That it is not like a static process or a trait in an individual. It's something that everyone can learn. And I think that that's really a critical piece, that you and I and all of us, we could play a role in creating services and environments that supports and promotes resilience. And it's something that can also look different in different settings and within families or within culture or broader community environments. So I'm just really trying to convey that it's a dynamic and complex process that needs to take into account biological, psychological, social, environmental, and cultural factors. Next slide. What it's not something a person has or does not have. It's not just about the person's skills and capabilities of the individuals. It's not really about an innate quality that, some people, they just have a lot of grit. Some people, they're really very hardy. They're just tough. They can handle, they can bounce back no matter what life throws at them. That's not what resiliency is about. It's not a fixed character trait, as I mentioned. Also, it's not just the absence of symptoms. Sometimes people think of, gee, you're resilient when you're not suffering, right? You're resilient when you don't have distress. You're resilient when you're not really having to cope, very strongly with situations that can kind of set you back, move you forward, set you back, move you forward. So it's not the same as a person's resilient when they're not experiencing distress. Next slide. And I think that this one is good. I keep going back to Dr. Yehuda, where I think has some good insights into this. And the idea that resiliency varies. And what do you think of this following statement? Just ask yourself, as I read this statement, just ask yourself, well, what do you think? You agree with this? Do you disagree with it? So here's the statement. Resilient people, at least the ones that Dr. Yehuda has known, may have had or still have very severe PTSD symptoms that they struggle with every day, but they don't succumb to its negative effects. So resilience involves an active decision, almost like sobriety, that must be frequently reconfirmed. That decision is to keep moving forward. I think that that's an interesting approach to understanding resilience. In a way, and I know most of you have certainly been exposed to the notion that when we respond to adversity, the common responses are fight, flight, and freeze. And I think what this conveys to me is, as long as you're kind of moving forward and you're not stuck, like you're not frozen, you're not in this freeze response, that there's resiliency that's going on, that the person is still either fighting, the person is still trying hard to kind of escape from situations that are difficult. So I think it's an important factor when we think of resilience, not to fall into the trap of thinking of it as a person who is free of distress. That it's really the critical piece is, how do we help people continue moving forward even when they're struggling with some significant challenges? Next slide. So what does the science tells us? This dude is really quick within a very short period of time. What the science tells us. Next slide. And much of the science really comes from using these resiliency measures, right? And there's a whole review of a lot of resiliency measures. There's at least 20 resiliency measures for kids or adolescents and adults out there. And there's probably more that people are developing, right? But the current measures, when I read them, so many of the items to determine whether you're resilient or not seems to kind of be something you really can't change very much. So it's kind of like a trait kind of idea. And it's similar to concepts that you may have come across called hardiness and grit. I'm not crazy about those terms, to be honest with you, because it almost seems like it's this notion of like toughness to the world. It develops some calluses to the kinds of challenges out there. I mean, I'm not really all that against it, but somehow I think the term hardiness and grit conveys a certain image and a message that I think resiliency may go beyond the notion of just being hardy and having a lot of grit. Next slide. So here he's going to give you examples of some very common ways of assessing resilience that's been used in the literature. So I want to just set the stage for, so how do they measure resilience? And these are sorts of common factors, right? The Connor-Davidson scale is very common. And one thing that people who are resilient, they seem to be flexible. They don't have like a rigid way of responding to situations. Another factor is social familial support. Now that's a lot of the degree to which you have environmental support, right? Your social network, your circle of support. That's a big piece of it. So now we're getting a little bit more into how the environment can be a source of resilience for individuals. Next slide. Another important factor, as it turns out, individuals who have a spiritual or philosophical perspective on life around that sometimes fate or that an external entity can be of some support, whatever person's belief system is, the notion that there is a reason for why things happen, and certainly the use of prayer or a sense of reassurance that there is support out there really beyond our own immediate environment. As it turns out, that seems to be associated with the ability to kind of handle difficult situations in a better way. And then being goal-oriented, right, is that you're moving forward. I think that's one of the points that Dr. Yehuda is trying to get at, is that an individual still making progress and moving forward, still pursuing some of their important life goals that makes life meaningful for them. Next slide. Another scale, resiliency scale for adults, personal competence is very big, acceptance of self and life. You'll hear that a lot, but just being able to kind of like have an acceptance towards that sometimes very difficult things can happen to an individual, and that you don't get into the notion of a lot of self-blame, which is really an important aspect. Next slide. So I just try to give you guys a summary of what some of the research has said. So if you score well on some of these surveys, right, resiliency measures, the higher resiliency score, the more likely you are to report you exercise, you ate more nutritiously, you used less tobacco products, you were less likely to experience depression, less likely to report fatigue, pain, depressive symptoms, more likely to report positive concepts, satisfaction with life, meaning in life, and more likely to report intrinsic religiosity. That's the notion of having really a spiritual side to you. So this is just sort of a very small sampling, but this is the kind of work that's taking place. Is there a relationship between your scores on a resiliency measure and some of these other positive indicators in life? Next slide. So when you look at a lot of programs that are focused on developing resilience, and there are increasingly large numbers of programs that are looking at this. In fact, about 4 years ago, I really got very interested in this, and I didn't find that many resources out there where you really want to focus on resilience. There's plenty of stuff out there on interventions for PTSD-related symptoms, other trauma-related symptoms. So the notion of trauma-specific treatments, there's plenty of that. But the piece that was really missing was really focusing on what we know about resilience, what we can do to actually enhance resilience. So a number of years ago, I just started to work on developing a workbook for adults with mental health problems, substance use problems, really anyone who's experienced some significant adversity. And it's a program designed to address it. It's called Brite. You might see it on some of the corners over here, which is an area that I've really been very excited by. I'm an old guy, so I have one more really oomph left in my career, and I'm gonna spend it really trying to promote resilience and really having it offered to people who are really struggling with all sorts of difficulties, both mental health, substance use, and other perhaps adversity-related types of difficulties. But one of the areas that I looked at in developing this approach was what were some of the common elements across resiliency supporting interventions. They often include emotional regulation, right? Training to recognize and manage your kind of reaction to certain stressors in your life. There's these basic cognitive behavioral approaches, because people who've had adversity can sometimes begin to think in ways that trip them up over and over again. So really taking a look at the kind of negative thinking that individuals can have. And if they don't overcome it, they're really going to be stuck. Physical health information, the importance of exercise, nutrition, sleep, and relaxation as a protective factor, the importance of social support, and the whole neurobiological component as mindfulness-based stress reduction, really to increase a person's ability to kind of activate what we call the parasympathetic system, which is the relaxing system, to overcome some of the negative impact of having an overactivated stress response system, the sympathetic nervous system. And you see that in programs as well. Next slide. So how do we build it? And this is something that's included in the work that I've been doing and developing of the Brite program, is the idea of really knowing deciding on how do you take care of yourself, enjoyable, calming, health-supporting lifestyle, mindfulness, learning stress reduction kind of approaches. Again, activating the parasympathetic nervous system. That's our system that helps us to relax and to calm down and to deal with stresses in life. Strengthening healthy supports, developing community connections, and knowing our triggers, and knowing how to really deal more effectively with unpleasant, emotionally harmful people, places, and things. Setting goals that are meaningful, accepting changes as part of life, recognizing self-defeating thoughts and beliefs, and developing more realistic and more positive perspectives, taking thoughtful action, building on strengths, recognizing the insights and self-discovery that may come. That's another very important aspect of resilience, is individuals who develop resilience, they often see that there was some, I don't want to say the word benefit, but there was some meaning that they got out of that horrendous adversities that they've experienced, either increasing their sense of empathy towards others. Sometimes it has to do with the way they creatively express that pain in their lives. They find ways of perhaps wanting to help other people, joining other people in self-help. There are strategies that people use in order to bring some meaning to the adversity, rather than just seeing it as it's a horrible thing that happened. There's no meaning whatsoever. There's no insight that I've gained, no empathy for others that I've gained through this experience. That oftentimes can be as damaging and hurtful as the actual adversity itself. And then empowerment is really critically important through education, gaining power by gathering information, increasing your knowledge and skills, informing and teaching people about adversity and trauma, about resilience, so that individuals can make more informed decisions in their lives. Next slide. So if anyone is interested in learning more about the Brite program that I've been doing now in New York State and across the country, really for adults 18 and over, which is all designed to support and promote resiliency. People do need tools. They need strategies, both the workforce, those who are providing services, and also resources for people who have experienced significant adversity. So if you have any interest whatsoever, please feel free to reach out, and if you want to learn more. And on that note, I'm going to turn it back to Suki.
Okay, thank you so much for your just the insights that you have on resiliency. I definitely think that that's one of the big blind spots that we have when we think about becoming trauma informed. And often we are trauma focused, but not exactly focused on resilience. And so the next portion of our webinar is really going to be focused on a strategy that is being employed here in Tennessee. And so the purpose of this, this portion is to show what one organization is doing to address becoming trauma informed and how they are also looking at it from the standpoint of resilience. And so I have Suki Steckel here from the University of Tennessee to share what she has been working on when it comes to the Collective Impact ACE Nashville and the Building Strong Brains grant here in Tennessee. Go ahead, Suki.
Great, thank you. I'm very excited to be here to share a little bit about what we are doing at the University of Tennessee College of Social Work as an academic partner to our ACE Nashville Collective Impact Initiative. And just to tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into this work, I am a macro social worker by trade. Social work is definitely my field of choice and passion. And I'm excited to talk about this idea of building resilience at the organizational level. And I think it's a really good juxtaposition to kind of building off of Dr. Salerno's talk about building resilience at the individual level. So kind of moving from that micro focused conversation to a macro lens. And I definitely came to this work through a macro lens. I've worked for the state of Tennessee in a variety of capacities for many, many years, almost 2 decades actually. And I've been with the university for about the last 4 years. And prior to that, I worked for the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services and served as both the System of Care Director and the Children's Mental Health Director. So I really spent a lot of time and energy focused on bringing systems together on behalf of children who had behavioral health needs and their families. So if you all are familiar with system of care initiatives in your communities, I definitely can empathize with you. And one of the things that I learned through that work is the need for trauma-informed care, not just in the behavioral health setting, but really in any organization that is working to impact the lives of people in any way. And I came to an understanding of ACEs and trauma-informed care through what was my experience at the Department of Mental Health, which wound up being about 8 years of, I could have been, instead of the director of children's mental health, I could have been the director of conflict engagement. We had so much conflict in that work, both between and among providers, state agencies, individual staff. And what I came to realize is that so much of the conflict that came about was really how people were showing up to the work and from their own adverse childhood experiences or their own traumatic background. And an example of that is within the social work field in general. There's been a couple of studies that have come out recently that have shown something like 47% of social work students have 4 or more ACEs. And so when you're talking about a population of helping professionals that have elevated ACE scores, especially at that threshold of 4 or more, we're talking about people who have significant adversity in their backgrounds that they're bringing into the workplace. And so I saw a lot of people's personal trauma showing up into systems that were sometimes traumatizing themselves or re-traumatizing, and also within a system that was working to serve people, a population of service recipients that were themselves traumatized or had elevated ACE scores themselves. And so you wound up having this kind of trifecta of triggers that would just show up at the individual staff level, at the organizational level, and at the client level, at the service recipient level. So there's so much going on there, and I think that if you're in the helping professions, that looking at building resilient organizations kind of through this trauma-informed care lens is really, really critical to long-term health of your employees, long-term health of organizations, and of course the long-term health of the people that we're trying to serve. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we came to find in our collective impact initiative around ACEs in Nashville is that trauma-informed care could almost become, too many informed choices. We really looked at so many of the different models. The SAMHSA TIP 57 is definitely the kind of backbone of where we wound up with the Roadmap to Resilience model, but there are a whole lot of other resources out there, both that are kind of organizational in nature, but also individual and more micro in nature. And so we really have spent the last several years trying to sort through all of these many well-researched resources and have kind of pulled them all together into what we're calling the Roadmap to Resilience. Next slide. Just a little bit of background about our initiative. We have what we call the Trauma-Informed Care Work Group, which is part of our local ACE Nashville kind of larger group. And they've worked for the last several years on synthesizing all of that information I showed on the previous slide and putting it into a usable, workable, what we used to call templates. That really were kind of this living and breathing document that the document on the left side that says Templates for Resilient Organizations Creating Productivity Through Safe, Stable, and Nurturing Environments is the product of a prior Building Strong Brains grant here in Tennessee. And that is a published document that became the basis of the Roadmap to Resilience. And if you were to see that entire document, it's a huge bound kind of notebook that is probably 2 to 3 inches thick, just filled with resources, and can be really, really overwhelming. Even though they spent years trying to kind of simplify a step-by-step process, creating PowerPoint trainings and handouts, and really strategically looking at policy overlays, trying to provide access to mentorship through the support of the Trauma-Informed Care Work Group. They really did yeoman's work on pulling together just probably thousands of pages of material into this kind of step-by-step guide. But at the end of the day, it became, like many other things, you know, a notebook on the shelf. And it's very hard for an organization to take that and really, you know, turn it into action and turn it into organizational change. And so that's where the University of Tennessee came in over the last year. And if you could advance the next slide, please. And just a little bit about my role within the college and how I've connected to ACE Nashville is that we got a Building Strong Brains grant over the last year. And over the last year, the college has agreed to develop and sustain an online system for dissemination of this new model. And that is actively in process, and we hope to launch it here in a little bit. So one of the biggest things with that transition and with the academic partnership that we have with the college is that we're going to build an online system that we hope will increase access for agencies throughout our ACE Nashville partnership, and hopefully long-term we'll have a statewide rollout for that. And we really tried to make it a more dynamic process and something that was not going to be a notebook on the shelf. It was going to be focused much more on robust user engagement, have lots more kind of live resources. Instead of having a PowerPoint that you can download, we'll have a recorded training of that with a PowerPoint as a handout. We've recorded some fabulous focus groups and have done some video production around that, which is our perspective of kind of our approach to that was by understanding that a lot of times organizational change can be done in a vacuum, but it's best done in community. And so we wanted to provide an opportunity for champions of trauma-informed care to basically view a conversation, kind of like a coffee talk, you know, how you would do in a community is you'd invite a colleague to lunch or something like that. But if you're in a rural community or you're somewhat isolated from other agencies who are engaged in this work, you might not have access to those colleagues that are you know, moving down this path along with you. So we have some great resources like that. And then one of the most significant things that has come out of this is that we have decided to attempt to validate, I won't say attempt, we are going to validate what we're calling temporarily as the Organizational Resilience Assessment. And we've gotten several different IRB approvals, and we are currently in the piloting phase of this assessment and with a number of different agencies across the country. And with the goal of having a publication about this and dissemination of what we are going to put forward as a non-proprietary instrument, which means that will be free and available once it has been published. And we really want agencies to be able to use this. And this is going to be a really important tool. It's a really important tool for the Roadmap to Resilience model, but it is also just an important, I think, advancement to the trauma-informed care field itself. There's not a lot of non-proprietary instruments out there. There may not be any that have been validated and studied in this way. And so we're really excited about this piece of the puzzle. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit about kind of moving from this kind of templates for resilient organizations to this idea of a roadmap to resilience. And we really realized that agencies need a roadmap. We can provide all the templates in the world, but without kind of more engagement, either through a mentor or through a system that can kind of hold your hand, so to speak, and walk you kind of step by step through a process, it's going to be really difficult to have that sustained change. So we really have moved over the last year from something that kind of serves as a model for others to copy to something that looks more like a plan or a strategy, you know, around this sustained organizational change with trauma-informed care. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, what the roadmap is I'll first say that it is not a clearinghouse of static information. This is not the notebook on the shelf. It is a dynamic platform designed for robust user engagement by providing a step-by-step roadmap for creating meaningful and sustained organizational change. You can see here the SAMHSA's Tip 57 well represented. As I said before, it is our backbone. We have departed from it a little bit, most notably with the last R in the 4 R's, which is about resisting re-traumatization. We have reframed that as achieving resilience, but also focusing on that it's an ongoing journey, sort of like you're never culturally competent. That's going to be a journey that you're going to go on. And so we've looked at the idea of resisting that re-traumatization to look more like organizational resilience, so that you do, as an organization, you have the capacity to bounce back when things are not going well, and really kind of take it to that next step of really thriving, especially when you're working in challenging environments and with challenging populations. One thing I wanted to highlight that is something that, you know, this is an evolution for us. We're really working together as a team, both within the college and with our community partners at ACE Nashville, on really elevating this work as much as we can, and we really have to confront some of the issues that are present with the available literature. And one of the things that we're currently investigating is this idea you can see here on the kind of top right triangle. It says culturally aware, and that's, you know, one of the principles that's outlined in SAMHSA's work, but we have the perspective that that really just doesn't go far enough, and that we are looking at providing resources and information and tools to help agencies truly address issues of equity and inclusion. And we take the position that you really can't engage in kind of full-blown trauma-informed care if you don't first address issues of racial equity or gender equity within your organization as a whole. Sometimes we have issues of structural trauma, structural racism, historic racism that is really present either in your organization, in your communities, or with the population that you're serving, or even with your staff. And so these are really important concepts that need to be addressed, and this model is attempting to do that, and we'll continue to improve on that as we move forward. Next slide, please. So I only have a few minutes left, but I will just kind of give you a really broad brush overview of what this model looks like. And so we have taken the 4 R's and reframed that last R. And so essentially how we've broken down the model is that you move through these 4 phases. And that first phase is realizing. And under the realizing phase, the model provides you with tips and tools for creating a group of champions within your organization. And champions are really the backbone of the work internally. And without a champion at your agency to really push this work forward, or whether that's one person or a group of people, preferably a group, it's going to be really hard to make that sustained organizational change. So there's a lot of resources around that. We also recognize that trauma-informed care, when you're moving from not being trauma-informed to a trauma-informed organization, that ultimately is a change management effort. And so we provide tools that help to support those issues. And one of those things is how to facilitate tough conversations. There's also some general training around Building Strong Brains, which is our Tennessee ACEs initiative work, as well as training around trauma-informed care. So really the realizing is kind of opening your eyes and sort of, you know, just taking a view of the landscape of, you know, what is trauma-informed care. Okay, next slide. I'm going to go ahead and skip through this one. Again, they're just examples, but I don't think I have time for them. So the next phase is recognizing. And so this is actually, so we've opened our eyes to increase our understanding of what trauma-informed care is. Now it's time to kind of stop and assess. And so phase 2 is, there are a number of assessments. One of them is the organizational resilience assessment that I mentioned earlier that we're working on validating. There's also a client satisfaction survey that we recommend, and an employee satisfaction survey, which is an underpinning of trauma-informed care itself. So we recommend, and earlier, this kind of trifecta of triggers that are possible within an organization, especially when you're dealing with service recipients who have a history of trauma. And so focusing on staff wellness is one of the critical features of this model. We want to lay a foundation for a culture of wellness. We understand that self-care plans are really important on an individual basis, but we believe that it's the organization's responsibility for promoting that overall culture of wellness. And so there's a lot of trainings and tips and tools about how to gain understanding of that, and then how to actually implement that in your organization. An additional feature of the assessment is that it is in alignment with the 10 implementation domains that Ingrid mentioned at the beginning of the hour. And so the purpose of the assessment is to get a better understanding of which of those domains you're doing well in, because we definitely want to promote a strengths-based implementation model, but then also we want to identify where you're maybe not doing so well. And we recognize that this idea of becoming trauma-informed as an organization can be extremely overwhelming, and especially when you have limited resources and funding and energy and limited staff. And so we thought it was a good idea to focus on, or at least give agencies a tool so that they could discern where they were doing well vis-a-vis where maybe they needed some work, so that they could focus those limited resources on where they need the most improvement, and then work that process over time. Next slide, please. And you can go ahead and skip forward again. So phase 2 or phase 3 is really looking at, how do you respond? So you've become aware, you've realized some things through all your assessments, and now it's time to actually, do something with that information. So this phase is all about responding. So this is about kind of action planning, and which you may have done in phase 2, but then also really figuring out, okay, how do we actually put those plans into place? You want to gain knowledge of different kind of communication techniques. You want to really examine your policies. If you're talking about organizational culture, policies is one of those ways that you actually really operationalize the trauma-informed principles. And so we actually, could you skip the next slide? This is an example of a policy overlay. We have many of these in our model. This one's about recognition and morale for staff. And so each of them we have this kind of overview of what the policy is on the left side, and then the right side is going to be examples of what this kind of how this policy plays out in a resilient organization versus how this policy might play out in a non-resilient organization. And so we're focused on providing really meaningful examples and meaningful tools. And so we anticipate that phase 3 is going to be one of the longer phases, and that this whole entire model, because it really is about organizational change, is going to take a significant amount of time, probably over years. But that's one of the things that we're going to study. Next slide, please. And I'll just wrap it up with the 4th phase. And this is all about, after you've done a lot of work, you stop and you reassess and you figure out, okay, where have you made improvements? Where do you still have work to do? We also want to focus on celebrating achievements, and we want to help agencies prepare to continue the work moving forward, and what is your plan for continuous quality improvement, and what is your plan for sustainability of these efforts over time? Sometimes when leaders change, everything can kind of all of a sudden go away. So this is about embedding these changes in the ongoing culture and making sure that they're embedded in strategic and funding plans moving forward. Next slide. Next slide. So I'll just say lastly, we do have a long-term goal for developing a statewide trauma responsive systems advisory council to help kind of move this work forward. We want to continue to focus on developing sector-specific supports and addressing issues of cultural competence, equity, and inclusion, and continuing the study of our organizational resilience assessment and making sure that that gets published and is widely available for folks to use. I'll just wrap it up there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Suki. This was very helpful. I think it really added some practical measures that people can take into account when they start their own initiatives. And so this concludes our presentation portion. So now let's look to see if we have any questions. Again, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box that you'll see probably in the lower middle of your screen. I have some questions myself for both of you. So when it comes to the importance of policy and also just thinking about embedding practices within organizations, what are some of the, I guess, the best practices when it comes to that? Let's start with you, Dr. Sloan.
All right, so when you're talking about policy, it really comes down to getting leadership support. Nothing's going to change unless you have leadership support in an organization. So the issue is how to make the case that having a trauma-informed, resiliency supporting organization is going to benefit, really in many ways benefit leadership, benefit the clients, benefit the staff, benefit the community. So that's a very important part of the messaging when anyone wants to introduce sort of a guiding set of principles to any new organization. So, you know, there's a whole approach called like managing up. So those who may want to influence leadership have to really think about what are the benefits across all stakeholders, how practical is this, what are the risks that are involved, and then to have an opportunity to examine, you know, policies and the degree to which trauma-informed resiliency is in support of the mission, not a new mission. And I think that that's a very important communication in order to influence leadership, which is going to be critical if you're going to influence policy.
Okay, Suki, what do you believe when it comes to the importance of policy when it comes to the trauma-informed process?
I could not agree with Dr. Salerno more. It is all about leadership. Getting leadership buy-in is one of the focus areas of our model, and we do one of those online recording, those videos that we talked about. Actually, that's the entire focus of that, is about, you know, how do you gain this buy-in? I agree that the issue of the kind of leading with some of that data, leading with those benefits. One of the things that we've found in our agencies, and I don't know if this is a feature, excuse me, I don't know if this is a feature of being in the South, but we have seen some agencies struggle with even just having a conversation about trauma, even when they're agencies that are serving populations with either a current or past history of trauma. And you might hear agency leadership say things like, you know, we don't have trauma. When, you know, I've just cited for you that half of your workers may have high ACE scores. So it's not just in your clients, it's in your staff. And so looking at things like turnover rates is one of the places where you may see that. there is some data to show that an organization that employs trauma-informed policies and practices will have a decreased rate of turnover. They will have an increased rate of productivity. We're hoping long-term to be able to demonstrate that you have better client outcomes, but that retention of employees and decreasing that staff turnover is one of the things that costs agencies the most in terms of dollars and time and energy. And so having policies that can actually work to support things like employee retention and really the long-term health of your employees is going to be really, really important to this work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Another question that has come up is going to be when it comes to starting the process of becoming trauma-informed, what is my first step? People are really looking for practical ways to get started. So what is the first step in that process? And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Solano.
Well, the very first step, I think, is one, building your own personal self-awareness around this, right? So you have to kind of recognize, what do we mean by trauma? What do we mean by resilience? Why does that really matter? Why is that really important? And secondly, individuals, this is not a quest on your own. You may have your own purview that you can begin to apply those principles and practices in the work that you have with your clients and your interactions with colleagues and things like that. But finding other like-minded people is really important, because it really does take a team of individuals to be both support to each other, to check things out with each other. And so part of it is, if you're a single individual in an organization, you're saying, look, I'm really into this, I think this is important, is starting to chat with other colleagues to see if you can get like-minded folks. If you have an opportunity to bring in some opportunities to learn and to expand that awareness to other folks in your organization, I think that that's probably the initial starting point.
Okay, thank you so much. That's perfect. Suki, what would you like to add to that about the first steps? What's the first thing I need to do?
I definitely agree with Dr. Salerno. The idea of not being able to do this in a vacuum. You really do need to have some partners. We mentioned that group of champions at the beginning, identifying who are your allies. I think having the self-awareness is important. I think being aware of what are the issues in your organization. Are there underlying issues of a lack of equity that everybody knows, but nobody's really dealing with? Are you having lots of turnover? And really being able to take a hard look at your agency is going to be one of those first steps. But definitely having identifying who's willing to even go on this journey, educating yourself about what this really means. Especially understanding things like you can't just do one training on trauma-informed care and then understand that, yeah, we check the box, we're trauma-informed. Or we provide trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy to our clients. Therefore, we're trauma-informed. Having a better understanding of what this really entails is important.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, this next question comes from Monica Glott, and what he's asking, and this is directed towards you, Dr. Salerno, are you aware of any messaging samples for agencies in the very beginning stages? So this is around messaging.
Yeah, I mean, what to consider in your messaging, right, is first of all, who's your audience? What is it that they really care about? What's high on their priorities? So it isn't like you have something on the shelf that you just sort of like present. It depends on the audience. So for leadership, when you're trying to influence leadership, this is what they're concerned about. And I recognize it because I was in a position of leadership of running a large department in a large psychiatric hospital. So if you wanted to influence me about making any kind of like change, the first thing is to sort of be aware of what's in my mind. One is, how practical, is this? How aligned is it with our mission? Is it likely to interfere with other high priority initiatives, that we have? What are the risks associated with it? Do you have a plan, or are you expecting me to come up with the plan? How is this going to enhance the reputation of our organization? Those are the kinds of things that like leaders care about. And then shaping a message that addresses that as a benefit. And then I think there's two other messages. One is you need to give people basic information, but there's also a lot of human stories around it. And I think, as Suki has sort of mentioned, this is not just about the clients. This is also about your workforce. And the idea of creating a healing environment for everyone, an environment of thriving. Leadership cares about the fact of both the financial impact of not doing things well and a high level of quality, and how you can address that, adverse events that take place. So there are a lot of important benefits associated with taking on a trauma-informed resiliency kind of perspective. And I think that's where you begin.
Okay, thank you so much. This next question is coming from Carrie Sip, and I think this is going to be for you, Suki. When you think about what is the number one greatest return on investment for becoming trauma-informed for organizations, what do you think that number one is going to be?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure I know how to answer that, because I really think that that's going to be dependent on the type of agency. So depending on if you're in residential treatment, are you in mental health, are you in child welfare, are you in education? I mean, for me, because I have such a macro lens, I'm definitely going to be focused on the health of the organization. I'm going to be focused on the health of the employees. But the reason that we're focused on that health is ultimately for the impact that we have on the clients that we're serving. And so I mean, but one of the issues with that is we're so new on this. We actually don't have a lot of concrete data on the direct impact of organizations that are trauma-informed and how that's increasing the health of clients or decreasing symptomology or things like that. But I would say that's ultimately the goal, is to see the benefits at the client level. Great question.
Okay, thank you. And so we are out of time, but there's one more question I want to have addressed, and this is for you, Dr. Solano. So what is the most reliable scale when it comes to resiliency for children and youth?
Yeah, you know what I would do is, it's an important question. Most of these scales are developed as part of research protocols. And that's not the same as something that you might want to use, clinically. And I know that people do this like a lot, is to take a scale that was really researched, designed, and use it like in a clinical approach. There is a scale on children and youth resilience. I actually could send that along to Ingrid, and maybe you can pass that along. But I would not think of it as I'm going to use this scale as in exactly the way it's developed, but rather I would put together a team, take a look at the scale, and extract from that scale the kinds of items that you think are really most pertinent to your organization. You don't have to approach a clinical process in the same way that a research protocol is approached. So that would be my recommendation. I could send that along to you, Ingrid, and then you can kind of send it along to others.
Yes, that would be great. And so this is going to conclude our webinar for today. Thank you so much for being involved, especially to our guest. Thank you so much for joining us on Good Friday. Here you'll see the different community facilitators that we have. One of the benefits of being an ACEs Connection member, if you are interested in starting your own local initiative or organization to address ACEs, you have a community facilitator who can help you with the trauma-informed process. And so thanks again for joining us. If you have any questions, please email me, and everyone should have my email. And then also, I just want to give a disclaimer that this presentation was not an endorsement of any particular service or intervention or program, but is really about information sharing. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.